During the riots, there have been real-time updates and clean-ups organised on sites like Twitter and Facebook. The Prime Minister has also asked for a review into whether social media sites should be shut down during times of unrest to stop looters contacting each other. Let's talk about this a bit. I'm joined now by three people, all prominent on Twitter. Conservative MP Louise Mensch, former Labour Deputy Prime Minister Lord Prescott, and Paul Lewis, who's been tweeting updates for The Guardian from the scene of the riots over the past few days. Thank you all for joining us. Paul Lewis, if I could start with you, what about this idea the government would shut down social networking sites in times of trouble?
Well, I mean, my personal view is that we do need to remain cautious. In times of crisis, it's often the case that societies seek an answer and they seek to do something about it. But equally, I think it's testament to us if we can hold strong, we can avoid knee-jerk reactions, and we can remember that social media is a new form of communication. It is with us to stay, it's not going anywhere. And it's really no surprise that anybody doing any action, whether it's criminal or in fact lawful, would be using a new form of communication to speak to each other. So I don't think that's a surprise. I genuinely do think it is a surprise that the government have announced this move. And I'll tell you why. I mean, if you think about the types of societies that have done this in the recent past, they are countries like Egypt. And there have been real consequences for freedom of expression in those places. Social media hasn't just to organise themselves. Forget it's been used by journalists like myself to communicate what was happening in the riots. Would Louise Mensch and Lord Prescott want to impede that? Let's not forget that social media has been used too by people to clean up after the riots. Would they also want to impede that?
OK, Paul, you raised a lot of points there. Can I turn to Louise Mensch? Are we like Egypt if we close down Twitter when things go bad?
No, and of course not, and that's not what the Prime Minister is talking about either. We're saying that if the police feel in a time of overwhelming national crisis that they would need to shut down very briefly, half an hour maximum, it's something that we could look at. I mean, there are lots of other things we want to look at first. Twitter, for example, has the power to stop hashtags being used. It can suppress that. We can look at banning individual users from Twitter and Facebook if we think they are organising riots. This may require more monitoring on the part of the companies than presently exists. Shutting Twitter down would be a last resort, and it would only be very brief and very temporary. It's amazing to see people getting their knickers in a twist about this.
Lord Prescott?
Well, first of all, it was who said twitting is for twits. He's very hostile to it anyway, and it was something else that was thrown in with everything else to look as if he was acting on it. Look, I don't know whether Louise has looked in the technical facts, whether you can close it down, but I don't accept the argument, Paul, that in fact it's a force for evil. It's a force for good. And Louise, if you've been reading all the tweets that I know you do, you will see the many people who depended on this way of Twitter to help them in these crises. More gain from it than those who were disadvantaged by it. And can you actually
I totally agree with Lord Prescott that Twitter is a force for good. There's no doubt about it. I use it all the time. We saw the riot cleanup hashtag, we saw the riot Wombles hashtag, we saw people mobilising on Twitter, as your report says, for use of good. But there was a certain time during the riots, as the Prime Minister the House of Commons, where things were being organised on social media. Paul Lewis's own report talked about riot in Enfield that he with The Guardian, he said, was organised in advance by use of BlackBerry Messenger. So if we are talking about very brief, very limited service interruptions, that's one option. As I say, it would be a last resort. There are many other things you can do on Twitter.
Can we just hear from Paul Lewis? Can we just hear from Paul Lewis for a second, please?
If I could just ask Louise Mensch a question. She said there that she'd been reports, but she said previously that what she advocated was temporary shutdown of social media. Now, social media is the way journalists report now. What she's essentially saying is that she's advocating something equivalent to a media blackout at times of crisis, at times when people need to know what's happening, and at times when journalists like myself need to utilise social media to get the message out.
But we're not talking about a media blackout, we're talking about a brief interruption coverage. When Twitter goes down for maintenance, the whole world doesn't lose its marbles. I think people are over-egging the pudding massively here. As I say, this will be a last resort. We can stop hashtags, we can stop individual users. Yes?
Louise, you actually take judgments, as you did with Piers Morgan, without looking at the facts. And can you tell me, can you do it selectively, or does it have to be done nationally? And I don't even agree with closing it down. There are millions of people who use this, including yourself, as a means of using it. And the police do the same thing. I know you're in America at the moment because you've done a tweet saying you're going to buy a wedding dress after this debate. Can I suggest you go to the New York police, their social media outfit, for monitoring and helping them in these criminal cases? The police use it, ordinary people use it for security.
I mean, Louise Mensch, we have to
they have just announced today that they're going to be monitoring crimes on Twitter and Facebook, and I think that's a very good idea. I heard from my local police force that rumours spread on Twitter caused unnecessary fear-mongering, lots of pressure on the call centre in Northamptonshire. There were fake reports of a riot in Wellingborough that didn't happen. Of course, Twitter is a force for good. I love it. I use it all the time. It's been terrific during the riots overall. But there may be cases where there's a limited case for either shutdown or stopping hashtags, for example, that you could do without shutting down the whole network. And I think saying social media is totally and we can't touch it with a barge pole, it's just like saying we should never shut down a road or a railway station. And we are only talking about the briefest interruption of service. The fact that people are getting in such a lather and such a froth about it, I think, is ridiculous.
Paul Lewis, can we hear
it sounds to me slightly as though, you know, what Louise Mensch is saying here is pretty much the equivalent to say, you know, during the rural swing riots of 1830, it was being organised by pamphlets. Let's somehow impede pamphlets. That's freedom of expression. She knows that Twitter has been used by people like myself, by others, not just to report what's going on, but to dampen down that very speculation that she was talking. Police were using it, journalists were using it, Sky News was using it brilliantly itself, and I think if we were to impede that, to lose that, simply as a knee-jerk reaction, as a reaction in a moment of crisis, that would be hot-headed and that would be wrong.
It wouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction, it would be something that the police would be calling for, and it would only be done if the Metropolitan Police or the Lead Police Force in a national emergency said they wanted it done. It wouldn't be done on the whim of government. And let's not forget, this is the 21st century equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre. There's no threat to freedom of expression by a very brief interruption. As I say, we could look at shutting down hashtag streams before we looked at closing the network or parts of the network. We could look at individual users. You don't want to go to the last resort first. But I think the police should have the tools that they ask for, and it amazes me that Lord Prescott is saying, apparently, that if the police ask for this tool, they shouldn't have it, however briefly.
No, I'm not saying that. The police it. And if you go to New York, you'll see they're using it there. The police want it, the community wants it, we want it, the press need it. This is an important expression of freedom. And Louise, you were the one that used the freedom of Parliament actually to say something about Morgan and then had to apologise after. Why do you want a censorship in this system?
Nobody is talking about shutting down Twitter unless the police ask for it. So the point is completely moot, isn't it? We're not just saying let's shut down Twitter on a whim. It would only be done in times of extreme national emergency if the police required it.
Can I just enter another thought here? Paul, can I just ask you, having looked, I'm sure you did at the debate in the House of Commons about the causes of the rioting, do you feel that by and large Westminster is looking in the right places for the answers to the problems?
Well, look, I want to say this. I think this is quite important because I was one of the first reporters to say that social media, particularly BlackBerry Messenger, was being used to orchestrate some of these riots. But that word orchestrate we should be careful about. I said it and I wrote it in the loosest of terms because it has been happening in loose terms. Messages have been flying around, destinations have been announced, targets have been described, and sometimes people turn up, other times people don't. But we're not talking here about some great, you know, feared monster, technological monster in itself caused the riots. The rioting has been done by people. They've been communicating as people do in the modern age. I think that's where it starts and that's where it ends.
Lord Prescott, how do you think the House of Commons debate went the other day into the causes of this?
Well, I think what Mr Cameron did was come up with a whole load of issues of which he said he makes changes. Now, of course, they were already in the law, but they weren't used by the police. And now that, in fact, he's trying to make the police look as if they didn't carry out the actions and he had to G them up. Now he's having to apologise. A typical Cameron manoeuvre. It's the same attitude he's got about twitting as he's got about the organisation and dealing with riots. It's all about PR, as Louise is an expert in, stimulates a debate but doesn't really know what the facts are.
Louise Mensch.
I know exactly what the facts are, and I think most people perfectly well agreed with the Prime Minister when he came back and announced that the numbers of police officers should be raised from 6,000 to 16,000, and we saw those tactics being used extremely effectively. The Prime Minister's job, it's the police's job to police, and politicians' job to hold the police to account for the job that they do. Now, if the police say that in an absolute emergency, they would require a brief interruption of service. I don't think it's anything for anybody to get lathered up over. And comparisons with Egypt are so ridiculous as to be laughable.
We're going to have to leave it there, Lord Prescott.
Lord
Prescott, I'm sorry, we've got to leave it there. Louise, Mensch and Lord Prescott, thank you very much indeed. Paul Lewis as well. Thank you all three for joining us.